But first, how many lessons been learned by those supposed VAT on school fees? Is the row finally, isn't it? Story so far. It was actually a year ago this weekend that the Labour published its election manifesto containing a pledge to add VAT to price election, and they did with the election. The majority to suggest the people those listening now quite like the idea of VAT and the money raised being spent on parents of some of the 6.8 countries. Polls were produced to support sums for technology. Perhaps the most moving cases that I heard were those on the children with education needs, some of whom are going to have been forced to use certain work. So that by saying next to nothing about the children with special education needs in the state system. And all I can say is if these kids in the state system don't see any of the benefits of 1.7 billion is going to raise, and it's something like 6,500 extra teachers. Kids with special education don't nothing short of scandalous. They're losing the VAT on fees campaign is losing the despite putting the now familiar arguments to the bench, with special needs, use have the requirements met by states. Dame Victoria Sharp, Lord Justice Newry, and Mr. Justice Chamberlain are having none of it with their 94-page decision. Families claiming their children required special needs provision that was hard to obtain in the state schools. The judges said the evidence quote shows not only how bad it might be for them if they had to transfer to the state sector, also how bad it currently is for many of the 1.1 million children with special needs who are already being educated in that sector. So the government said 6,500 new teachers could be funded by the money raised from this tax, £7 billion. Now the antis have lost in court. Is this the end of the line? Can we all move on? And no one likes paying tax. They say, no, don't mind. Grumbles were anticipated, but have lessons been learned? Now, that's another question in my mind. What have we learned from the campaign? I wanted to know if the interests of the privileged few can trump the interests of the great majority. 03456060973, the number to get involved in this conversation. In a moment, I'll be talking to Francis Gilbert, host of the Mindful Learning podcast. First to Sarah Kinane, spokesperson from the Independent Schools Council, who wrote in that corporate. On to you, Sarah.
Good morning.
Is this the end of the road for your campaign?
I don't think so, no. This was an unprecedented tax on education, and it was right to test its compatibility with human rights law. But it's also right that we continue to raise the negative impact that this tax has had and continues to have across both state and independent education. We know that over 4 times the government estimate for children leaving independent education have left this year. They had indicated it would be about 3,000. It's actually been around 13,000 across the UK. And it doesn't take the sums to be off by much. And as you can see there, they're off by more than a factor of 4. For the policy not only not to raise anything, but potentially cost the taxpayer money. What we also know, you spoke there about money going towards state schools. We also know that the government has watered down its rhetoric on that, talking about giving it to public services, including education, and Keir Starmer saying on Thursday that it would go towards affordable housing. So what we're looking at now is a very real prospect of money leaving the education ecosystem and not going back, which won't help any children.
The judges were sort of kind of clear that the debate needs to focus on the larger cohort of children. Remember looking at something like special educational needs who've been forgotten in this discussion. It's all right for the privileged few, but what about everybody else?
Well, first of all, I'd take objection to the privileged few. There's a lot of diversity in different.
It's still 6.8% of the population going to private school. That is by any definition a few.
Yes, so I would you if not the privileged. But the thing is that education is an ecosystem, and if children are moving from the independent sector to the state sector, we know that the SEND provision within the state is in crisis. If more children move from the independent sector into the state sector, that is going to increase pressure. At the moment, it's a bit akin to what Health Secretary Wes Streeton talks about when he talks about people using private healthcare to ease the pressure on the NHS. The more children, and we have 110,000 1,000 children in our schools without any LTP, but who require SEND support, who opt out of the state system and use independent education, choose that school for their child, the more resource there is within the state sector. The same is true of school competition. We know Sutton Trust research that where there is increased competition for state schools, it is disproportionately the disadvantaged who lose out on those excellent state school places. So actually, this isn't just the case of what you refer to as the privileged few. It's something that will have ripple effects across education and could really harm state SEND provision as well as those disadvantaged children getting those great state school places.
What can you do, Sarah? Judicial review?
Well, obviously, as we said, we will be considering our next steps, but we feel it's very important to hold the government to account. They have made some claims about how much this policy would raise, how many children would leave the sector, the improvements that they plan to make to the SEND system, and we think it's important to highlight where the rhetoric is not being matched with action or cash.
And fair play with that regard. Although it is nice from my position to actually hear people talking investing in the state system for a change. Sarah Kinane, lovely talking to you. Let's bring in Frances Gilbert, teacher in London and host of the Mindful Learning podcast. It sounds like that lady for sure, Sarah Kinane, is not for turning, to borrow a phrase from another committed woman. What do you make of Friday's ruling?
I'm supportive. I whilst acknowledging Sarah's points, as someone who's spent decades in education as a teacher, author, parent, and now an advocate for mindful learning, I've seen the deep inequalities in our system. So taxing private schools is a modest but meaningful step towards fairness. And I think the first argument is this is a progressive and fair policy. Until the policy came in, the private schools were effectively subsidised by the taxpayer through VAT exemption, despite only serving 7% of the population. And this policy has removed that regressive tax break and redirects resources into the state sector, where the majority of children are educated. It's not about punishing the wealthy. This is about removing a privilege that entrenches inequality. And I think the key point is that greater investment in state schools helps everyone. The revenue raised from the VAT will be reinvested in state schools, improving teacher recruitment, infrastructure, pupils support. And state schools already educate a wide variety of abilities and backgrounds. More funding equals better outcomes for everyone. As a parent, I know that, having my taxes help reduce class sizes and provide specialist support in local comprehensives, I feel proud of that. I don't feel penalised at all. And we've got to think about reducing social segregation in this country. Private schools by design separate children by wealth. And research does show that integration improves social mobility, empathy, civic engagement. So, we need children learning from all backgrounds together, not living in parallel worlds from age 5.
So, I find it curious but not altogether surprising where the weighting of the arguments has been, particularly in the right-wing press.
Well, I mean, obviously, the right-wing press is funded by people who send their children to private schools. So it's no surprise that the right-wing press is very anti this policy. But I should encourage, wealthy parents to stay in the state system. It is a really good thing. Once you do get wealthy, aspirational parents involved in state schools, they do improve significantly. I know, obviously, I wouldn't count myself as wealthy on the level of, a media magnate, but I sent my child to the local comprehensive in Bethnal Green. He's done very well. I've just done a podcast about it. He got great GCSEs, but he mixed with all of the local children in the local area. Went to local sixth form college, did extremely well, and actually we do know quite a lot of people within the private sending their children to private schools. And he did just as well, if not better than them in the end. He's 25 now, got on the civil service fast track, a musician, but the state being involved as a governor in the local school, being involved with helping out in other ways, really helped that school, I think.
Susan, that the message from government has been diluted. Correct. Are we going to see 6,500? It's not your job, obviously, to talk about government policy. I think we're going to see 6,500 extra teachers. Are we going to see improved support for children with special educational needs?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Matthew. We do need to hold the government to account here. And, we do know that, for example, in the last Labour government, it was Ed Balls, wasn't it? It was Education Secretary. They had a reading catch-up programme, one-to-one reading, where the money was clearly earmarked for a particular policy. And that really worked. You kind of earmark in the successive government for pupil premium. So, taxpayers can see where that money's gone. And I do think we need to hold the government to account so that, it's very clear that the policy has actually had a measurable effect.